What made all the pets I know suddenly start hating me? For 3 years straight, I'd walked past Greg's house every morning at 7:15, and his golden retriever would lose his mind with joy. That dog would spin in circles and whine until I came over to scratch behind his ears through the fence before heading to my job at the pet store downtown. Greg used to joke that his dog loved me more than him, and honestly, he might have been right because that dog would wait by the fence every single morning like clockwork. Then they started tearing up the main road for some infrastructure project that was supposed to last 6 months. The detour added 20 minutes to my walk and would have made me late for work, so I decided to cut through the abandoned railway tunnel that runs under the hill behind our neighborhood. People avoided it because homeless folks sometimes camped there, but it was morning and I figured I'd be fine walking through quickly. The tunnel was darker than I expected, even with my phone flashlight, and it smelled like rust and something else I couldn't identify. About halfway through, I felt this weird tingling sensation on my skin, like static electricity was building up all around me. The air felt heavy and thick, and for a second I could have sworn I heard something moving in the walls, but I kept walking because I was already running late. When I came out the other side and walked past Greg's house, his dog went absolutely insane, but not in a good way. The dog started howling like someone was torturing him and backing away from the fence with his tail between his legs. His eyes were huge, and he was shaking so bad I could see it from the sidewalk. Greg came running out asking what I'd done to his dog, and I just stood there completely confused because I hadn't done anything except walk by like always. Greg brought his dog to the vet that afternoon thinking maybe he was sick or having some kind of episode. The vet ran all these tests and said the dog was perfectly healthy, just severely stressed about something. Greg asked me if I'd changed my cologne or deodorant or maybe stepped in something weird, but I was using all the same products I'd been using for years. The vet suggested maybe I'd picked up some kind of pheromone that was triggering a fear response, but couldn't explain what that would be. I tried everything to fix whatever was wrong, including taking 3 showers with different soaps and washing all my clothes twice. Nothing worked because when I walked by the next morning, the dog literally tried to jump over the fence to get away from me. Greg had to grab him before he hurt himself, and the look he gave me was like I'd betrayed him somehow. He asked me to please walk on the other side of the street from now on, which absolutely destroyed me because I loved that dog. Then things got so much worse because it wasn't just Greg's dog anymore. Every dog in the neighborhood started acting like I was their worst nightmare. My elderly neighbor's poodle would bark non-stop whenever I walked by, and the family across the street's usually friendly pit bull almost broke through their screen door trying to get away from me. Even cats would hiss and run when they saw me coming, and birds would fly away in huge groups like something was hunting them. My manager at the pet store noticed the animals were acting strange around me and asked if everything was okay at home. I tried to explain, but it sounded completely insane, saying that every animal in town suddenly hated me for no reason. She suggested I take a few days off to figure out what was happening, but those days turned into a week, and then she called to say maybe I should find a different job since the animals were too stressed with me there. My girlfriend Luna had this theory that maybe I'd been exposed to some chemical in that tunnel that changed my scent in a way only animals could detect. We went back to check it out, but the city had already sealed both entrances with concrete barriers and warning signs about structural damage. I called the city planning office to ask what had been in there, but they just said it was an old railway tunnel from the 1940s and nothing special. After weeks of this, Greg knocked on my door and his face was completely white like he'd seen something horrible. He said he'd been up all night researching and making phone calls, and he'd finally figured out what happened to me. His cousin, who worked on the construction crew, had sent him something I needed to see immediately. Greg's hands were shaking as he pulled out his phone, and I could tell whatever he'd discovered had genuinely scared him. He asked if I'd noticed anything else weird happening besides the animals. When I said no, he just stared at me for the longest time. Then he turned his phone toward me and said, "This is what they found when they opened the tunnel." I looked at the screen and immediately understood why they'd sealed it so fast. Before I could even process what I was seeing, Greg asked me a question that made my entire body go cold. "Have you been getting headaches?" The photo on his screen showed workers in white hazmat suits dragging rusted metal drums out of the tunnel, while other workers pulled plastic-wrapped bundles that looked way too much like dead animals. The drums had faded warning labels, and some were leaking thick black stuff onto the tunnel floor. My stomach dropped because I remembered that weird smell and the tingling on my skin. Greg kept staring at me, waiting for an answer, so I nodded and told him yeah, I'd been getting these splitting headaches every afternoon. He asked about metallic tastes in my mouth, and if my skin felt different, and when I said yes to both, his face went even whiter. He grabbed my arm and said we needed to get me to a doctor who knew about chemical exposure right now because this was way worse than he thought. The rest of that day turned into a blur of phone calls and internet searches. Luna spent hours calling different clinics trying to find someone who specialized in this stuff, while I sat at my laptop reading about pesticide poisoning and industrial solvents. Every article made me more scared because the symptoms matched perfectly with what I'd been feeling. The headaches, the weird taste, the way my skin felt tight and hot sometimes, even the way I'd been tired all the time lately. 3 days later, I was sitting in Dr. Isolde Brandt's office explaining everything from walking through the tunnel to how every animal in town now acted like I was death itself. She took notes on everything and asked really specific questions about the tunnel, like how long I was in there and if I touched anything or breathed through my mouth. She ordered blood work to test for something called volatile organic compounds and pesticide metabolites, which she said would tell us exactly what chemicals I'd absorbed. The nurse took 6 vials of blood and said the results would take about a week. That week felt like a month because every time an animal freaked out near me, I thought about what poison might be leaking out of my skin. When the results came back, Dr. Brandt called me in immediately, and her face told me everything before she even started talking. The tests showed crazy high levels of old chlorinated pesticides that hadn't been used since the 70s. She explained these chemicals get stored in body fat and slowly leak out through skin oils and sweat, which is why animals could smell them on me. The good news was, it wasn't immediately life-threatening, but the bad news was, it could take months or even a year for my body to clear them out. She put me on this strict protocol with special charcoal soap that was supposed to bind to the toxins on my skin. I had to take cold showers twice a day because hot water opened pores and released released more chemicals. She gave me a list of foods to eat that would help my liver process the toxins faster, and supplements that might speed things up. The whole routine took hours every day between the special washing and preparing the right foods. I tried the new routine for 2 weeks, hoping maybe it would at least reduce how bad animals reacted to me. It didn't work at all because dogs still howled when I walked by, and cats still ran like I was chasing them. The only difference now was I knew exactly what poison was seeping out of my pores, making them terrified. My elderly neighbor who owned that poodle filed a complaint with the Homeowners Association, saying I was creating a disturbance with all the barking. The HOA sent me a warning letter saying I had 30 days to resolve the issue, or they'd start fining me $50 a day. I tried explaining the situation, but they didn't care about chemical exposure or tunnels or anything except stopping the noise complaints. Around the same time, my old manager from the pet store called to make my termination official. She sounded really sorry and said she'd give me a neutral reference for future jobs, but the animals' welfare had to come first. She mentioned they'd already hired someone new, and business was back to normal, which hurt more than getting fired. Luna started making excuses when her friends wanted to hang out if they had pets. She'd suggest meeting at restaurants instead of their houses, or say she was busy when they planned dog park visits. She still loved me and kept saying we'd get through this, but I could see how hard it was for her. She couldn't even visit her sister anymore because they had 3 cats that went crazy whenever I was mentioned. We tried going to her parents' house for dinner, but their neighbor's dogs barked the entire time, and her dad kept giving me these looks like I was ruining everything. Luna held my hand under the table, but we both knew this was becoming impossible. The next morning, Greg texted me that his dog had torn up his paws trying to dig under their fence when I walked by for work. He said the vet needed to put stitches in, and he couldn't afford this happening again, so maybe I should take a different route from now on. There's something really odd about how quickly everyone just accepts this chemical explanation without asking harder questions about what those drums were doing there in the first place. Greg's cousin conveniently having insider info, and those workers in hazmat suits finding wrapped bundles that look. I started walking 3 blocks out of my way to avoid his street, but it didn't matter because every dog in the neighborhood knew when I was anywhere close. Luna drove me to the grocery store that weekend since walking anywhere had become a nightmare. I was grabbing cereal when this golden retriever with a service vest started going crazy in the aisle. The dog was pulling so hard on its harness that the blind woman holding it almost fell over. She kept asking what was wrong while her dog howled like something was killing it. Everyone in the store turned to stare at me standing there with a box of cornflakes while this service dog lost its mind. The woman's husband came running from the next aisle and grabbed the harness to help control the dog. He looked right at me and asked if I'd done something to upset their dog. I just dropped my basket and walked out while people whispered behind me about what kind of person makes a service dog panic like that. Luna found me sitting in the car trying not to cry because this was getting worse every single day. She drove us home without saying anything, but I could see her hands shaking on the steering wheel. 3 days later, my test results finally came back from the lab, and Isolde called me immediately. She said the chemical levels in my blood were unlike anything she'd seen before, and she needed to refer me to someone who specialized in this exact type of exposure. She gave me the number for Weaver Carlisle, who apparently was the only toxicologist in the state who'd studied these specific compounds. I called his office right away, but his secretary said the earliest appointment was 2 weeks out unless it was an emergency. When I explained about the animals, she put me on hold for 5 minutes, then came back saying he could see me tomorrow at 7 in the morning. His office was in the University Medical Center 40 minutes away, so Luna had to drive me since I couldn't take the bus anymore without causing chaos. Weaver turned out to be this older guy with thick glasses who got excited when he saw my lab results. He said these chemicals were developed in the 60s for military research, but got banned after they discovered the long-term effects on test subjects. The compounds bind to fat cells and get released slowly through skin oils, which is why animals could smell them even though humans couldn't detect anything. He wanted to run more tests to figure out exactly how much was in my system and how long it would take to clear out naturally. While waiting for those results, I decided to email Turner Calloway at the city planning office to ask directly what they'd found in that tunnel. His response came back within an hour with the most generic corporate speak I'd ever seen. He said the tunnel was closed due to structural concerns and public safety, but wouldn't say anything about chemicals or hazardous materials. When I pressed him for more information, he stopped responding to my emails completely. I got so frustrated that I went to the courthouse and filed a Freedom of Information Act request for all documents related to the tunnel closure. The clerk said they had 30 days to respond, but warned me that the city often took the full time allowed. 2 weeks into waiting, my landlord called about complaints from other tenants. He said 3 different people had reported their pets going crazy in the hallways, and they'd figured out it happened whenever I was around. He tried to be nice about it, but basically said if this didn't get fixed soon, he might not be able to renew my lease. Luna's apartment didn't allow pets, but we'd been talking about moving in together anyway until this whole thing started. Now she couldn't even mention my name at her building without the manager's cat freaking out. I'd been applying for jobs since the pet store let me go, and finally got an interview at a warehouse across town. The manager seemed impressed with my experience and said I was exactly what they were looking for. Everything was going great until his dog came out from under his desk and started having what looked like a seizure. The poor beagle was shaking and whimpering while trying to crawl away from me. The manager picked up his dog and asked me to leave immediately. I never got a call back even though I was perfect for that job. Weaver finally called with the results from his advanced testing and asked me to come in right away. He explained that these specific chemicals bind to lipids in a way that makes them incredibly hard to eliminate from the body. They get stored in fat cells, then released slowly through sebaceous glands in the skin. Animals can detect concentrations as low as a few parts per trillion, which is why every animal reacted so strongly to my presence. He said at the rate my body was naturally clearing them, it would take 18 months before the levels dropped enough for animals to tolerate being near me. 18 months of not being able to work or go anywhere or have a normal life. He designed what he called an aggressive treatment protocol using prescription medications that would speed up fat metabolism and force my body to burn through the stored chemicals faster. The plan also included wearing special clothing made from activated carbon fabric that that would absorb the oils from my skin before they could disperse into the air. The medications alone would cost $300 a month, and insurance wouldn't cover any of it since this was considered experimental treatment. The special clothing was another $500 for a basic set, and I'd need to replace it every few weeks as the fabric got saturated. I emptied my savings account to pay for the first month of treatment and started taking the pills that made me dizzy and gave me constant headaches. Some mornings I thought maybe the neighbor's cat didn't run quite as fast when it saw me coming. Then I'd walk past another house, and their dog would start howling, and I'd realize nothing had really changed yet. 3 days later, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a woman said she was Tabitha Bracken from the local paper. She'd been following the tunnel closure story and heard from multiple construction workers about strange safety concerns that the city was trying to keep quiet. She asked if I'd experienced any weird health effects since walking through there, and I almost hung up, but something in her voice made me hesitate. She said she'd been tracking similar chemical discoveries at old industrial sites across the state and thought there might be a pattern the city didn't want people knowing about. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop downtown where nobody from my neighborhood would see us. She showed up with a thick folder full of documents and newspaper clippings from other towns where old tunnels and factories had been sealed without explanation. She promised to keep my name out of any story if I shared what happened to me, and showed her my medical records from the clinic visits. I pulled out my phone and showed her the test results and the specialist's notes about the unknown compounds in my blood while she took photos of everything with her camera. She said 3 other people had contacted her with similar stories, but I was the first with actual medical documentation proving exposure to something. The next morning, the city put out this super vague press release warning people to stay away from the tunnel area due to ongoing investigations. They threatened to arrest anyone for trespassing who tried to get near the sealed entrances, which just made everyone more curious about what they were hiding. My phone buzzed with a text from Greg, saying his cousin had been pulled into his boss's office and told if he shared any more information about what they found in that tunnel, he'd be fired immediately. The construction company was getting pressure from somewhere high up to keep their workers quiet about whatever contamination they'd discovered down there. I called around until I found a lawyer named Stone Broderick, who specialized in environmental cases, and made an appointment for that afternoon. His office was in this old building downtown, and he listened to my whole story while taking notes on a yellow legal pad. He said I could file a notice of claim against the city for medical monitoring and damages, but warned me these cases usually took years to resolve, and most people gave up before seeing any money. He told me to save everything that might have traces of contamination as evidence, even though I'd already washed my shoes and backpack multiple times trying to fix the animal problem. I went home and sealed them in plastic bags along with the clothes I'd worn that day, then started keeping a detailed notebook of every animal reaction and symptom I experienced. The next week, I was walking through the park when this woman's therapy dog, wearing a service vest, started going completely insane as I passed by. The dog was trained to stay calm in any situation, but it started pulling so hard on its leash trying to get away from me that it almost knocked the woman over. She was yelling at me, asking what I'd done to her dog while other people in the park stopped to stare at us. I started doing all my shopping at the 24-hour grocery store at 2 in the morning when nobody would be walking their pets. Luna had been trying to be supportive, but the stress was getting to her, especially after her friend's cat scratched her face when she came home with my scent on her clothes. She packed a bag and said she needed to stay with her sister for a while to think about everything. She kept saying she wasn't breaking up with me, but needed space to figure out if she could handle living like this long term. The house felt empty without her, and I spent most nights researching chemical exposure cases online, trying to find anyone who'd been through something similar. Then the newspaper ran this article about the mysterious tunnel closure that didn't use my name, but described the animal reaction phenomenon in detail. I'm really curious why the city is being so secretive about those chemicals, if Weaver already knows exactly what they are from the 60s military research. Luna needing space right when things get tough makes me wonder if she was already looking for a reason to step back from this relationship. My neighbors started putting it together pretty quick since they'd all seen their pets freaking out when I walked by their houses. People would cross the street when they saw me coming or pull their kids closer like I was contagious or dangerous. The city called a community meeting at the high school gym to address concerns about the tunnel, and I sat in the back row watching Turner Calloway dodge every real question. Someone asked directly about chemical contamination, and he just kept saying they were conducting further studies with no timeline for when results would be available. The room got louder as people demanded real answers about what was in that tunnel and whether the whole neighborhood was at risk. Turner just stood there sweating under the gym lights, repeating the same empty promises about transparency and public safety while providing zero actual information. I finally couldn't take it anymore and shot my hand up from the middle of the crowd. Turner pointed at me, and I stood up feeling everyone's eyes on me as I asked why they'd sealed the tunnel so fast if there wasn't any hazard inside. The whole gym went quiet waiting for his answer, but he just cleared his throat and said residents with personal medical concerns should discuss them with their doctors, and then he pointed to someone else for the next question. My face burned as I sat back down because everyone knew he was dodging the real issue, and some people actually started booing him. The meeting broke up after that with nothing resolved and people filing out angry and scared about what was really happening in our neighborhood. Outside in the parking lot, a woman I'd never seen before walked straight up to me and handed me a business card that said Weaver Carlisle with some kind of environmental consulting company logo on it. She said she'd been following cases like mine for 15 years, and the chemicals showing up in my blood work matched military-grade pesticides that were stored in underground sites all over the country during the Cold War. My stomach dropped as she explained that these chemicals were designed to bond with organic tissue and could take years to fully break down, which meant I was basically a walking contamination zone to any animal with a sensitive enough nose. She gave me the name of a specialist who might be able to help and told me to document everything because I'd need it for the lawsuit I should definitely be filing against the city. The next morning, I drove 2 hours to see Dr. Brandt, who ran more tests and sat me down with charts showing chemical decay rates that made me want to throw up. She said realistically it would take 6 months to a year for the levels to drop enough that animals might start tolerating my presence again, but there was no guarantee it would ever go back to normal completely. She recommended I start seeing a therapist to deal with the isolation because this was going to be a long process, and most people in my situation developed serious depression from losing their connection to the animal world. I left her office with a stack of papers about chemical exposure and a referral to a lawyer named Stone Broderick, who specialized in environmental contamination cases. Stone filed the notice of claim with the city 3 weeks later, but their response was exactly what he expected. Just standard denial language with no acknowledgement of any responsibility for what happened to me. He said this was completely normal, and we'd have to go through months of discovery and depositions before they'd even consider a settlement, but at least we had the process started. While all this legal stuff was happening, my regular life kept falling apart piece by piece, starting with the letter my landlord slipped under my door giving me 30 days notice that my lease wouldn't be renewed. He said the ongoing disturbances with neighborhood pets were creating a hostile living environment for other tenants, and he couldn't risk losing more residents because of my situation. I spent the next 3 weeks calling every apartment complex in town, trying to find a place that had strict no-pet policies so I wouldn't cause problems for anyone else. Finally found a small studio in a pet-free building clear across town that cost more than my old place, even though it was half the size. The move was brutal because I had to do everything myself since none of my friends wanted to be around me long enough to help, and professional movers kept asking why their dispatch hadn't mentioned there was some kind of biohazard involved. My new place was on the 4th floor with a view of the parking lot, and the walls were so thin I could hear every conversation from the apartments around me, but at least there were no animals to freak out. Greg came by about a week after I moved, but he stayed in his car at the curb while we talked through our open windows because he couldn't risk bringing his dog anywhere near me. He kept saying how sorry he was about everything and how he wished there was more he could do to help, but we both knew there wasn't really anything anyone could do except wait for time to fix what the tunnel had broken. After he left, I sat at my window watching normal people walk their dogs down the street and felt like I was looking at a completely different world I couldn't be part of anymore. One afternoon, about a month later, I was walking to the grocery store when this orange tabby cat came around the corner and didn't immediately run away from me. My heart started racing as the cat actually took a few steps toward me, and for a second I thought maybe the chemicals were finally starting to fade. But then the cat's ears went flat against its head and it bolted across the street, nearly getting hit by a car trying to get away from me. That night I mapped out new walking routes on my computer with detailed timing charts showing when people in different neighborhoods walked their dogs so I could avoid all the peak pet traffic times. Started carrying a laminated card in my wallet explaining my medical condition in case anyone confronted me about their animals acting weird, because I was tired of trying to explain the whole tunnel story to strangers who thought I was some kind of monster. The pet store had already been off limits for months, but now I couldn't even work retail or food service because too many customers brought service animals or emotional support pets with them. After 2 months of applications and rejections, I finally got hired for a remote data entry job that paid half what the pet store did, but at least I could do it from my apartment without terrifying anyone's pets. Luna started coming over twice a week, but we had to meet at the coffee shop 3 blocks away because the owner didn't allow pets inside. She'd sit across from me with her hands wrapped around her mug and try to act like everything was normal, but I could see her checking her phone every few minutes to make sure her sister wasn't bringing her dog by early. We set up video calls for the other nights, and she'd prop her laptop on the kitchen counter while making dinner so we could talk without her roommate's cat wandering into frame. The first time the cat jumped up behind her, she panicked and slammed the laptop shut so fast she knocked over a whole pot of pasta sauce. She called back crying and saying she was sorry, but I told her it was fine, even though we both knew this wasn't working the way we wanted it to. 2 weeks into this new routine, a letter arrived from the city's legal department with an offer of $8,000 for medical monitoring costs if I signed away my right to sue. I called Stone Broderick, who Greg had recommended, and he looked at the paperwork during our meeting at his office downtown. He spread the pages across his desk and pointed at different sections while explaining how they were trying to limit their liability before more information came out. The monitoring alone had already cost me $12,000, and that was just for the first 2 months of blood work and specialist visits. Stone told me to wait because his contacts at the state environmental agency were investigating, and more evidence would probably surface soon. He didn't charge me for the consultation and said to call him when I was ready to move forward. 3 months after walking through that tunnel, I went back to the medical center for more blood work, and the nurse had to stick me 4 times to find a vein that would cooperate. The results came back showing the metabolite levels had dropped from dangerous to elevated, which the doctor said was progress, even though I was still way outside normal ranges. She printed out a chart showing the decline and estimated it would take at least another 6 months before I'd be close to baseline levels. The therapist I started seeing worked out of a small office above a bookstore, and she never tried to make me look for silver linings or hidden meanings in what happened. She just let me talk about losing my job and my normal life, and how much I missed being able to pet dogs without them running away terrified. Some sessions I just sat there describing all the things I couldn't do anymore while she took notes and nodded. She said grief didn't always come from death, and losing the life you knew counted as something worth mourning. After a while, people in the neighborhood stopped talking about me because someone's teenager got arrested for selling drugs, and that became the new drama everyone focused on. I still crossed the street when I saw someone walking their dog, and took the long way around to avoid houses with fenced yards, but at least people stopped staring at me like I was dangerous. Tabitha Bracken's article came out in the state's biggest newspaper with a full investigation showing the railway company had dumped chemicals at 12 different sites across the state in the 50s and 60s. She'd found internal documents showing they knew the chemicals were dangerous, but classified them as industrial lubricants to avoid disposal fees. Why does Turner Calloway act like everyone can't see right through his obvious dodging at that meeting? His sweating and throat clearing while giving those empty responses makes me wonder what he personally knows about this whole chemical situation that he's not saying. The tunnel I'd walked through was one of the worst sites with contamination levels that should have triggered immediate federal cleanup requirements. The article included photos of the other sites and quotes from experts saying anyone exposed needed immediate medical attention. Nobody from the railway company would comment, and the state said they were investigating but couldn't discuss ongoing inquiries. I decided to start looking for places outside the city after my lease ended in 4 months, because living somewhere with fewer people and pets would make everything easier. When I told Greg, he said he understood and promised we'd stay in touch even after I moved. He'd been checking on me every week since this started, and was one of the only people who didn't act weird around me anymore. Luna came over that night, and we sat on my couch with the windows open so we could hear if any neighbors were walking their dogs. She said we needed to be realistic about whether this relationship could survive with all these restrictions and limitations. We both knew the answer, but neither of us wanted to say it out loud, so we agreed to just take things month by month without making promises we couldn't keep. The data entry job started picking up, and I added 2 more clients who needed help with their backlogged invoices and inventory systems. The work was boring and repetitive, but it paid enough to cover my rent and medical bills without having to leave my apartment or deal with anyone's pets. I set up 3 monitors on my desk and developed a system for switching between clients that let me bill more hours without working longer days. 4 months after the exposure, I was taking my trash out when my neighbor's orange cat came around the corner and stopped in the hallway. Instead of hissing and running like every other time, it just looked at me and slowly backed away toward their door without the usual panic. I stood completely still holding the garbage bag while the cat watched me for maybe 10 seconds before turning and walking away at normal speed. My hands were shaking when I got back inside because that was the first time in months an animal hadn't completely lost it when they saw me. The next morning, I called Dr. Brandt's office to tell them about the cat, and they got me in that same afternoon. She looked at my latest blood work results for about 10 minutes before pulling out this thick medical book and showing me a chart about heavy metal elimination rates. The numbers showed my levels were dropping, but way slower than normal detox cases, which meant whatever I'd absorbed in that tunnel wasn't acting like regular contamination. She wrote me prescriptions for 3 new supplements, including something called DMSA that was supposed to help bind to the metals and flush them out faster. The pharmacy had to special order 2 of them, and the total cost even with insurance was almost $400, but I didn't care because I needed any chance at getting better. While I waited for the meds to arrive, Greg texted me a news article about 3 other people who'd reported getting sick after using the tunnel shortcut before the city sealed it. 2 of them had breathing problems, and one guy said his skin burned whenever he went outside, which sounded different from my animal problem, but still proved something toxic was in there. Greg's cousin on the construction crew had told him they'd found old chemical drums from the 50s when they started digging, and the railway company was trying to keep it quiet. I spent that night searching online for lawyers who handled environmental cases and found this guy Stone Broderick, who'd won a huge case against a chemical plant 2 towns over. His secretary said he'd call me back within 2 days, and when he did, he asked me to send him everything, including medical records and any photos I had of the tunnel. Meanwhile, I found this online support group for people with chemical sensitivities, and even though my situation was weird, they let me join after I explained what happened. Most of them had gotten sick from mold or workplace chemicals, but they understood what it was like when your own body turned against you. They shared tips about detox protocols and which doctors actually believed patients, instead of saying it was all in your head. One woman from the group lived 2 hours away and had the same burning sensation the other tunnel victim described, so we started comparing notes about symptoms and timelines. Stone called back a week later, saying he'd taken on 2 other tunnel cases and wanted to file them together as a group, which would put more pressure on the city to settle. The city's lawyers were already nervous because apparently the railway company hadn't disclosed the chemical storage when they sold the tunnel rights 40 years ago. 3 weeks into the new supplements, I walked past a house with 2 dogs in the yard, and only one of them freaked out while the other just watched me nervously. It wasn't much, but it was the first real sign the treatment might be working, even if it was happening incredibly slowly. Luna came over that night, and we both knew what we had to talk about, even though neither of us wanted to start the conversation. She said she loved me, but couldn't keep living like this with me, basically trapped in the apartment and her doing all the outside errands. We'd been together 3 years, and she'd stuck by me through 4 months of this nightmare, but we both knew it wasn't fair to either of us anymore. She moved her stuff out over the next few days, and we agreed to stay friends and keep texting, which we actually did, unlike most couples who say that. Stone called 2 months later saying the city had quietly settled with the other 2 victims for amounts he couldn't disclose, but it was enough to make them happy. He used those settlements as leverage, saying my case was worse since I'd lost my job and couldn't even leave my apartment for months. The city offered $30,000 at first, which Stone said was insulting, and countered with $200,000 plus medical monitoring. They went back and forth for weeks while I kept taking the supplements and tracking every tiny improvement in how animals reacted to me. 5 months after that first cat incident, I decided to test myself by walking past the dog park at the absolute farthest edge of the sidewalk. About half the dogs started barking and pulling on their leashes, but the other half just watched me or kept playing, which was still awful, but so much better than before. The owner closest to me grabbed her lab's collar and gave me a dirty look, but at least the dog wasn't trying to literally run away in terror anymore. Stone finally called saying the city offered $75,000 plus 5 years of medical monitoring and blood tests, which he thought was the best we'd get without going to trial. The settlement papers were 50 pages long and included a bunch of stuff about not discussing details publicly, but Stone said that was standard. I signed everything at his office downtown, and he said the check would come in about 6 weeks after all the processing was done. 2 weeks later, I loaded everything I owned into a rental truck because I couldn't stay in that town anymore with all the memories and failed attempts to get my life back. On my way out, I stopped at the tunnel entrance, which was now completely sealed with concrete barriers and yellow warning signs about structural danger. I put my hand on the cold concrete for just a second, thinking about how one stupid decision to take a shortcut had changed absolutely everything. Then I got back in the truck and started driving toward my sister's place 3 states away, where nobody knew my story, and maybe I could start over even if animals would never fully trust me again. Man, thanks for hanging out and wondering about all these weird little things with me today. It's always fun sharing these curious moments together. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.